Hello and welcome to IGYS Ministry, a place where we come together to be encouraged, empowered, and inspired. I'm your host, Chaplain Sam Miller, historian, veteran, and social activist, bringing you community news, reflection, and resources to veterans 1 hour at a time. If you are a veteran who's homeless or at risk of homelessness, please reach out. Call the National Center for Homeless Veterans at 988 and press 1. Trained counselors are standing by to help 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The best part is that you don't have to be enrolled in VA benefits or healthcare to call. You'll be connected with a real person qualified to support you and the ones you love. That number again is 988 and press 1. On today's episode of I Got Your Six Ministry, we will begin a two-part series and explore how past public policies have contributed to chronic homelessness in African American veterans here in the United States. Before we begin, I humbly ask that you open your heart and mind to something new and different. Oftentimes, we want to respond rather than listening to understand. Just keep in mind that none of us were around to create or influence any of the past policies here in the United States. America is not perfect, and its past has sometimes been undesirable. However, the spirit of America has never given up on its people, and the words of the Declaration of Independence remain true, that all men are created equal and have an unalienable right to life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness. Now, decades of racism, segregation, and discrimination have made it clear that past public policies have hurt the African American community, especially when it comes to homelessness. While most people view homelessness as an economic, financial, mental health, or substance related issue, it goes far beyond that. For instance, let's look at a few historical dates. In 1607, colonists stole land by force from native people and forced them to leave ancestral homelands. They killed tens of thousands of indigenous people while spreading deadly disease. In essence, homelessness has been in America since it was first founded. In 1619, 20 slaves were stolen from their homes in West Africa and brought to the English settlement of Jamestown, marking the beginning of a transatlantic slave trade that would bring millions from their homes and families to the land that the British were colonizing in North America over the next 2 centuries. In 1804, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the newly formed country, expediting the expansion of slaves from the South to the West and the ongoing theft and massacres of Native Americans, robbing them of their land. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, displacing another tens of thousands of Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and other Native people who suffered from deadly disease, starvation, and exhaustion as they migrated west. This was the first federal legislation to create mass homelessness. In 1863, free blacks experienced homelessness on the edges of the Union Army camps and northern cities after the Emancipation Proclamation. On December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. And while this was a major victory, there were also some side effects. So, for instance, imagine this scenario. It's 1865, and slave owner comes out and he's talking to, let's call him John. He's been enslaved for the past all of his life. So he walks up to him and says, "Well, John, it says here in the paper that you and your family could leave. I can't keep you here no more. How you feel about that?" And John says, "I feel pretty good. I've been here all my life and time for me to move on." And so imagine this dilemma. John's been on his property all his life. Once he leaves, he has nowhere to go. His home is on this plot of land. He has no tools. If he leaves, he has his freedom, but then what? Now, to some people, they would say, well, then slavery is a good thing because it gave people homes, it ended homelessness. Of course, we know that's not true. Um, we have to keep in mind that um, John's situation was really difficult. Imagine him trying to escape once, twice, three times. Now he finally gets a chance to leave and has absolutely nowhere to go. Imagine the mental health, the PTSD that he's experiencing for him and his family. To make matters worse, the 13th Amendment did not grant African Americans citizenship or the ability to vote. These men, women, and children would still be governed by the same people who enslaved them. Without citizenship, they could be deported. And the worst part of the 13th Amendment stated that um, it created the prison system. It stated that there will be neither free nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. So if you committed a crime, you could, in theory, be enslaved. So let's go back to that scenario again. Slave owner says, you can leave. But remember 5 years ago when you stole that apple? He says, yes, sir, I remember. Well, I want to let you go, but according to this right here, you stole that apple, you got to still work for me. Now, this is where Section 2 of the 13th Amendment gets tricky. Because Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Thus, the Black Codes, Jim Crow, and Separate but Equal was born. Now, the Black Codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability as cheap labor force after slavery. Although the Union victory had given some 4 million enslaved people their freedom, the question of free black status in the South was still unresolved. The key to the Black Codes was what they call vagrancy laws. Every adult black person was required to sign a labor contract for the year with a white employer. If they did not do so, they would be considered a vagrant and they could be fined. And if they couldn't pay the fine, they could be auctioned off to someone who would pay the fine. And then they would have to work off that fine for that person. So in a lot of ways, that's still considered slavery. Now, perhaps this is why so many African Americans insisted on joining the military during World War I. But what we do know is that a year later in Tennessee, the Ku Klux Klan would be formed. It coincided with the creation of the Black Codes. You could argue that on some level, the Klan attempted to do the same thing the slave patrols did. Now, during slavery, the slave patrols would make sure that people had passes, kind of like a hall pass in school, making sure that African Americans were not loitering, they were not getting together in bands of people. As you can see, the police and African American community has not had a great relationship for over 150 years. Now, although factions against freed African Americans were growing, many had their eyes set on two laws that were instrumental in creating change in the United States. The first was the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1866, which granted all people born naturalized in the United States and its territories, including enslaved people, equal protection under the law. The second was the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote in 1870. Until now, many African Americans were forced to follow the laws that typically did not favor them. Men and women who fought in times of war and conflict did not receive their fair share. They did not receive their pension or pay, including Army veteran Harriet Tubman. History often is silent about Tubman's military accomplishments, but instead focuses on her willingness to lead enslaved people throughout the Underground Railroad. Now that African Americans were citizens after the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and the 15th, many could vote. Many men could vote. And many had joined the military, even if it meant going on the front lines. Many felt like, look, let us prove that we are, prove our worth, and when we come back, grant us citizenship. You have nothing to fear. But we know that fighting on the front lines often leads to certain death. For instance, let me give you a biblical example. According to 2 Kings, 2 Samuel chapter 11, King David sent Uriah the Hittite to the front line of battle, where he was certain to be killed, and he was. King David had did this because he had committed adultery with Uriah's wife Bathsheba. He laid with her, she became pregnant, and David was hoping that by sending Uriah to the front lines, he would be killed in battle, and David would be able to marry Bathsheba without any repercussion. However, after Uriah's death, David was confronted by the prophet Nathan and was held accountable for his actions. Now, as we listen to these following stories and events, let us wonder, where is the Nathan who speaks out about the injustice of the African American service members? So the first event we'll recall is the Brownsville Raid. On August 13th, 14th, in 1906, historically known as the Brownsville Raid, this was a historically racially charged event in Brownsville, Texas, that involved a group of black soldiers stationed at Fort Brown. The soldiers were accused of committing a shooting spree in town, which resulted in the death of a white bartender and the injury of a police officer. Now, despite lacking conclusive evidence, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered the entire unit to be given a dishonorable discharge, resulting in the loss of pension benefits for 167 soldiers. Now, imagine that instantly, 167 soldiers are now homeless. They have nowhere to go. Now, imagine if they were married. Each person was married. Now it's double. Let's say that each person had a child. Now it's triple. So just like that, America once again is creating a homeless problem. The soldiers did not receive a trial, and President Roosevelt added that some of the soldiers were bloody butchers that should be hung. Now, thankfully, in 1971, Black Democratic Congressman Augustus Hawkins introduced a bill to declare the discharges honorable. Now, after an investigation, it was found that the bullets recovered during the incident did not come from any of the weapons issued to that unit. Now, many people probably thinking, how are they going to do an investigation 70 years later? Well, an investigation was done at that time, and the information was still there. But without a trial, who are you going to give that to? So now, a year later, in 1972, President Richard Nixon approved of honorable discharges with no other compensation. Now, even as they fought for the freedom and democracy of their country, African American soldiers faced systemic racism and discrimination, as exemplified by the Brownsville affair. But now, get this. Imagine signing up to protect U.S. citizens, but you have to watch your back from the enemy as well as those you were called to protect. Imagine hearing someone yell, "I would rather die than to have a Negro save my life." Again, imagine the psyche of that service member. The next event is the 9th Cavalry. Now, on April 3rd, 1911, President William H. Taft ordered the U.S. Army to expel all the 9th Cavalry from San Antonio. U.S. Congressman John Garner urged Taft to expel the black cavalry from Texas because of the program. They protested segregated seating in streetcars, which threatened local law and order. So soon after, President Taft, he thought about it. He sent a memorandum to General Wood, the Army's Chief of Staff, ordering him to remove the 9th Cavalry from San Antonio. So they figured, let's just get them out of San Antonio, put them somewhere else where they don't get no trouble. 2 days later, the soldiers moved to Rio Grande City. That's near Mexico, the border. White residents there protested the black cavalry by saying that they were continually looking for opportunities to exercise brutality. So, um, there's stereotypes of saying what they may do. Now, faced with more hostility, President Taft had to call them back. He said, okay, can't put them there either. Tell you what, let's put them back in San Antonio. Now, the residents back in the Rio Grande City, they praised the decision. They was happy. But now the people in San Antonio, once again, are unhappy. So President Taft had to move them one more time. This time in July of 1911, they were moved to Fort Russell, Wyoming. Now imagine what it must be like to volunteer to fight for your country that doesn't want you. The next event we'll look at is President Woodrow Wilson. It's not one event; it is many, because the actions of President Woodrow Wilson have had a lasting impact on Black Americans' progress even to this day. He actively supported segregation, discrimination against Black Americans, even going so far as to screen Birth of a Nation at the White House in 1915. You know that movie which glorifies the Ku Klux Klan and portrays Black Americans as inferior and dangerous? Wilson is said to have made the following remark after watching the movie. He said, "It's like writing history with lightning. My only complaint is that everything is so dreadfully accurate." Over the past 7 decades, this quote will be made in many books and articles countless times. Now, in addition to this movie and other things, Wilson also faced segregated federal workplaces. He removed many Black Americans from high ranking positions, undoing the progress that had been made during Reconstruction. This decision further perpetuated discrimination against Black Americans and limited their opportunities within the armed forces, resulting in military segregation. His policies set back the fight for racial equality and justice and led many African Americans to head north for work. This event was known as the Great Migration, which was one of the largest movements of people in the United States. Approximately 6 million Black people moved from the South to northern, Midwest, Western states from roughly 1910 to 1970-ish. The Great Migration is important because when the war began, the U.S. economy was in a recession. But a 44-month economic boom ensued from 1914 to 1918. First, as Europeans began purchasing U.S. goods for the war, and later when the United States joined the war itself. The long period of the U.S. neutrality made the ultimate conversion of the economy to a wartime basis easier than otherwise would have been expected. Real plants and equipments were added, and because they were added in response to a demand from other countries already at war, we were precisely in position to move and build plants in areas where it was most populous. This is where your Detroit, Buffalo, Cleveland, all of those cities, the Rust Belt is what we call it today, really took off. Now, entry into the war in 1917 unleashed a massive U.S. federal spending, which shifted national production from civilian goods to war goods. Between 1914 and 1918, some 3 million people were added to the military and 500,000 to the government. Overall, unemployment declined. It went down from 7.9 to 1.4 during this period. In part because workers were drawn to these new manufacturing jobs and because the military draft removed many young people from the civilian labor workforce. Now, the United States, again, only declared war when Germany renewed its oceanic attacks that affected international shipping. So, like, look, you messing with my money now, we're going to have to come down on you. So, in April, that happened April 1917. Now, African Americans who have participated in every military conflict, we can go back to Spanish-American War, go back to Revolutionary War, and every conflict here in between. Um, African Americans have participated in every conflict. Um, However, many of those who enlisted or were drafted found themselves in non combative support roles. So many African Americans served under the Service of Supply section of the American forces. This section comprised of stevedores, laborers, engineers. Um, the main function of these companies was to support and provide materials to other companies along the front. The most notable, however, were the soldiers who fought on the front line in the 92nd and 93rd Division. The 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, were assigned to the French Army. And this was America's way of saying, you know what, we don't want them here. We're going to send them to the French. Let them deal with them. And if some of them die off, so be it. Um, but in this post, the Hellfighters saw much action. They fought on quite a few battles, but they were successful in what they did. For example, even the Germans called them the Black Devils. This was the only unit to be commanded by black officers. There were many standouts. Um, for example, um, Corporal Freddie Stowers, he was a standout. He led troops through German lines in spite of receiving mortal wounds. He was recommended for a Medal of Honor shortly after, but he did not receive it until 1991. That's 73 years later. But what made this unit so special is that it served on the front line for 6 months, longer than any other American unit in the war, and made notable due to their lack of training. Like these guys, again, were not trained. They were just expected to go in there and get killed, thin out the African American population. Because remember, during times of slavery, black people were a commodity. But now that they were no longer enslaved, it was time to thin them out. And the easiest way for the government to do it would have been to send them into war. The unit never lost any prisoners or territory to the enemy during this time. This was phenomenal and unheard of. With victory in hand, many African Americans had high hopes for receiving equal pay and equal treatment now that they have shown their worth for fighting on the front lines to defend the United States of America. However, when they came home to a new type of violent conflict waiting for them. An outbreak of racial violence known as the Red Scare occurred in 1919, an event that affected at least 26 cities across the United States. Racial tension across the United States was exacerbated by the discharge of millions of military personnel back to their homes and domestic lives following the end of the war. Competition for opportunities in the post war America combined with racially changed social landscapes placed black and whites in conflicts with one another, leading to tragic results. In many cases, northern whites, many of them newly arrived immigrants, did not welcome black newcomers. Many feared the return of tens of thousands of black veterans with experience living abroad and significantly having military training would be unwilling to resubmit to traditional political and social subjugation in the United States. In the years that followed, a long battle, many were looking forward to payment bonuses. Congress and the White House were in a conflict with each other. President Harding and Cooling both vetoed early attempts to provide bonuses to World War I veterans. Um, the Bonus Act, what it was designed to do, it promised World War I veterans a bonus based on length of time between April 1917 and July of 1919. So you would get $1 a day if you were stateside, or $1.25 if you were overseas, with a payout capped at about $500 for stateside veterans and $625 for overseas veterans. Thankfully, Congress approved it and vetoed Coolidge and Harding. So many were able to get something. However, African Americans did not get their fair share. These veterans were unfortunately caught in a catch-22. This bonus would not pay out until the veteran's birthday in 1945. You could pay out to his estate if he should die before then. That's where the term bought the farm comes from. Although veterans were allowed to borrow against the bonus certificate in 1927, by 1932 the banks were short on credit, and thus the Great Depression came about. So many people lost what they were hoping to get. They went to war and fought for the country, and sadly, when they needed their money the most, the country had turned their backs. This is where we're going to stop on this segment. Again, this is part one of a two-part series. But I want to reiterate, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you are a veteran, or if you are homeless or at imminent risk of being homeless, please reach out. Please call the National Center for Homeless Veterans at 988 and press 1. Trained counselors are standing by 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to help. The best part is you do not have to be enrolled in VA care or have VA benefits. You'll connect with a real person qualified to support you and the ones you love. Again, that phone number is 988 and press 1. Thank you for joining today. This is a place where we come together to be encouraged, empowered, and inspired. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, take care.